Give it- There we go. Thank you. We have Seth tonight, Seth Cohen. Thank you for taking over. Craig's away for a few days. So this is the third of 12 discussions about Jewish history, focusing on smaller figures that represent certain larger concepts. So we began with, in the Torah, with Tamar, and the reminder of the key women that are often forgotten or not spoken about, that actually play a really an essential role in the development of our family history, particularly, but also in the development of eventually the king's line, which becomes the Messianic line. And then we looked at the period of the Judges, which followed after Joshua's conquest. So part of all of this, how many of you can just kind of raise your hand if you have seen Professor Gates' Finding Our Roots on PBS, right? So a few of you have seen that. You know, that whole idea of our roots really is about our story, personally. We each have certain stories in our family, and those are stories that have been passed to us, often by family members. Some of us may have done some real investigating and gotten some genealogical information. Most of us really have this sense of who we are out of the stories that we've heard. Growing up, stories our grandparents may have told, our aunts and uncles, stories that were passed down through our parents. It doesn't mean these stories are true. It doesn't mean they actually happened. And one of the things we see in Finding Our Roots is periodically those stories become myths because they find a newspaper article that disproves or says it happened in a different way. Or Professor Gates finds some genealogical evidence that shows that the person could not have come from where they said they came from, right? Now, what does that do to the person who is sitting there hearing that? Well, for most people, it's kind of an interesting thing, but it doesn't shatter them. They still think of themselves in much the same way they already did, but it kind of adds to the richness of their story. Now, when we think of the story of the Jewish people, our stories come through a non-historical approach, right? We talked about this, we'll continue to talk about it. We were not interested as a people in history. We were interested in God's revealed words, the lessons they were to give us. And so the only stories that were passed down were stories, if in effect, that would explain to us what God or what our tradition was saying to us in our time. So in historical terms, Abram and then Abraham, as he and Sarai became Sarah, that's the portion we're actually in this week, Lech Lecha, with that beginning process. When they were talked about, it was irrelevant who was ruling or when they left it, right? It doesn't matter who the government was in Ur of the Casdids or in Haran, where they settled before Abram and Sarai went to the land of Canaan. It wasn't even important who was controlling the area of Canaan. All of that would have been an historical approach, right? The historian would have wanted to know that, wanted to know what was the structure of the Canaanite cities. How did they rule? What years did they dominate? Certain ones dominate and others not dominate. What was their relationship to Egypt? What was their relationship to the Fertile Crescent country, right? They would have wanted to know all of those details. And when history is written today, that is the way it's written. And they would look today at archaeological evidence. Now, in the last 2 centuries, Jews started writing Jewish history. That's how young it is. I don't know if I told you this, but the first professor of Jewish history in history was at Columbia in 1930. That was the first time a professor of Jewish history was established in a university as a Jewish historian. That's how long, it's like less than 100 years ago. When you think about our tradition that goes back 4,000 years, and we've been writing law, we've been writing philosophy, we've been writing midrash, we've been writing prayers, we've been writing all kinds of things, theology, but we never wrote history. Because again, once the revelation was done, once the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, was finished, it didn't really matter that we knew history. What mattered to our tradition is that we knew how to live, what God wanted us to do, what our tradition demanded of us. So it wasn't so important who was the Pharaoh that exiled Moses to the wilderness, right? What was important was, how do you keep Passover, right? What do you eat on Passover? That was important. It wasn't really important when Joshua invaded who was the king of Jericho when he made war on Jericho. And it doesn't say anything about that. What was important was that the Jewish people in the wilderness apparently didn't circumcise their sons. So Joshua established the circumcision again, which seemed to have fallen away during the wilderness, because that's halacha. That's important. That was Jewish tradition. That's part of our story going back to Abraham. Now, what I'm saying to you is that there are a lot of ways to view Jewish history, but what we're talking about through this class is how historians view it, not how the Jewish tradition views it. Jewish tradition still views it as speaking to us about how we should live our lives. History, in the modern sense, is trying to understand what was really going on. What really happened? Was there a Moses? Did there actually exist an exodus from Egypt with 600,000 men plus women and children? Did that actually happen? Was there an Abraham? Was his son named Isaac? Do we have any evidence about that? And I can tell you right now, we have none. There is no evidence about anything in the Torah that would validate any of the 5 book stories. Nothing. Remember, they were slaves in Egypt. Before that, they were wanderers. They were a family. And once they got into the wilderness, they didn't have cities, right? So there was nothing for archaeologists to dig up. They weren't writing documents. That was much later when they started writing documents, and they wrote them out of clay tablets. But we don't have anything from the Torah period. Nothing, nada, zilch. And of course, if you look at Egypt, they didn't record the slaves. They weren't interested in who the slaves were. So we don't have any evidence from there. We don't have any real evidence even during the early days of the settlement during Joshua's period. There are some ideas that archaeologists have come up with about some kind of wars that were fought in certain cities, but they're not exactly in tune with the timeline that traditionally we look at when we look at Jewish history. So I'm going to give you a little of that timeline in broad terms, so just give us a reference. Traditionally, Abraham is about 1800 BCE, right? So almost 4,000 years ago, 3,900 years ago, right? About 1800 BCE, before the Common Era. The Exodus from Egypt is about 1250 to 1300. So that's already 500 years later. We've just passed 500 years in one book, right? That's Genesis. We get to Exodus, we're now dealing with 1300 to 1250, right? And then we spend 40 years in the wilderness. So around the year 1200, we invade, Joshua invades Canaan, the promised land. It takes about 200 years to get to King David conquering the city of Jerusalem. So the judges period is about 200 years. And during that period, as we saw when we looked at Samson, it was a chaotic period. There was no central government. Certain charismatic leaders like Samson and Deborah arose, led certain tribes for a while, but basically each tribe was on its own, and they all had to deal with the forces of their world. The bigger nations like Egypt and like the nations in the East. They had to deal with all of that when the Philistines invaded. So now we have story of Samson fighting the Philistines. But what happened when Samson died? The Philistines were still there. He didn't kill them all. He knocked down the temple and killed a few hundred, but there were still lots of them. So the Philistines continued to attack Jewish settlements. And that was a kind of chaos from a standpoint of organization. So eventually, the only leadership that really existed consistently were the Kohanim, the priests, which was a religious leadership. So there were priests, Jewish priests, who had some kind of leadership, but it wasn't political leadership and it wasn't military. And at a certain point, the tribes kind of reached a stage where they said, it's enough already. We need some kind of leadership, government. And they looked around, and what did they see? They see pharaohs, they see kings, and they see these big nations have a central authority with a military might. And they decide, okay, we don't get along so well. You know, Jews always struggle a bit to get along with each other. We don't get along so well, but for the greater good, let's find a way to come together. And I've used that parallel of the 13 colonies, eventually figuring out how to come together, even though they had vast differences, in order to create a government. And then struggling for many years until the Civil War, and finally what seems to have settled, the idea of one nation. That doesn't mean we get along. It only means we've all decided we're better in it together than we are separately. Even though Texas still wants to secede, and we have all that craziness, but the reality, the states have decided we're stronger together and we'll deal with our differences. Now the Jews eventually come to that point, the tribes. And when they do, you have at that time a very important leader, Samuel, who was the religious leader, Shmuel. He's the main religious leader. And we have a nice story of how Samuel is brought to the temple because his mother has trouble getting pregnant, and God gives her a son, and she dedicates him to the temple. It's not the temple in Jerusalem. It's only the central worship area of Jewish people. But why did I pick the daughter of his name is Jephthah. Why did I pick the daughter of Jephthah as a transition into the kings? Why do you think? How many of you read that story? Yeah. Right? Were you shocked by that story?
It was very
All right, so why do you think I picked her story and his story as a way to go into the kings?
Because of the chaos, the lack of any ethical conduct. He was a disaster.
Yeah, not only a disaster, the one thing we said from very beginning of the story, we had a story of a father told to sacrifice his son. And God says, no, I don't want that. So right at the beginning of our story, it says clearly, no child sacrifice. And we will see that echoed throughout our tradition, even during the king's period, because there were religions around that apparently did sacrifice children. Again, we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence to that effect. What they used to think was archaeological evidence, they would find the bones of babies and little children that were buried in the walls of the houses. And they believe that at a certain point, archaeologists believe that this was a sacrifice of a child to protect the house. But what they now believe is it was just a way of burying. But again, we don't know for sure. We haven't found like a place where they sacrificed and buried all these children, in one place. So we don't know, but the Torah makes it pretty clear. Our story makes it pretty clear you don't sacrifice children. And on top of it, Yiftach makes this pledge, and then he has ways out of it. And he won't take them. And he's hell-bent on killing his daughter. And the rabbis, and that's some of the material I gave you, the rabbis just go excoriate him. And they get angry at Pinchas, who is the high priest of that day, that he won't intervene because of his ego. Because Yiftach doesn't come to him. And he says, who am I to go to Yiftach? Now that's the rabbis telling the story, because they're so shocked and so angry that this would have actually taken place. And in effect, it almost was the straw that broke the camel's back. There was another story that I didn't give you because it's even bloodier, about the prostitute of Benjamin, who gets cut up into little pieces. I said it last time, and sent out to all the tribes. But those kinds of incidences ultimately bring the people to say, we can't keep doing this. We got to find a way to get order. And so they decide on a king. And who do they pick as their first king? So I'm going to ask Seth if you would share that timeline. We'll take a look at it. Yeah, there it is. Okay. So hold it for a second. If you can see, so before David, around the year 1000, we have Saul. Now, why is Saul chosen? Well, God chooses Saul through Samuel the prophet. That's the story that we tell ourselves. But Saul was from an important tribe. He was tall. He was a fighter, a warrior, and he was respected by the troops that were fighting in the various tribes. So their first inclination is, let's pick a military leader, in effect like we had with Joshua. Not like Moses, but more like Joshua. Someone who can lead us into battle and maybe won't have great ambitions about acquiring wealth, because kings tended to do that. They tended to tax the people, right? They tended to acquire various things for themselves, including wives, have big families in those days through many wives. They acquired horses, they acquired gold. The place that they acquired it was through war. Who pays during war? The average soldiers and the average families, particularly when they lose battles, right? So they go to Saul, and Saul leads them for a period of time, as you can see, not a short period of time. And during that period, they seem to have a number of victories, right? They have a number of victories. They don't expand greatly, but they kind of come together. Saul doesn't ever unite all 12 tribes, but he unites most of them, and they fight together, and they seem to have some cohesion. And it gives them a taste for what it is to have a leader. Now, our story, the way we tell it, we'll come back to this. Seth, if you would stop sharing for a minute. Okay. So the story we tell ourselves in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, is that Saul angered God. Now, how did Saul anger God? In our story, this is for us, not for history. In our story, Saul was given a command by God. You must kill all the Amalekites. Now, remember, the Amalekites are in the story of us leaving Egypt, right? They're the ones that attacked us as soon as we left Egypt, and they attacked from behind where our weak and infirm and elderly were. And they slaughtered them until we could turn and have victory and protect them. So the Amalekites are considered to be, Amalek is like evil. God says, wipe them out. I want them, this is a tribe that should not have further existence. Saul makes war on the Amalekites. He's victorious. God said to destroy everything, even the cattle, even the possessions, and every man, woman, and child. Now, that may seem terribly vicious to us, but remember, we're coming out of the Judges period, and that's what it was like. It was a murderous, bloody time. Saul doesn't do that. First of all, he saves the king. He doesn't kill the king of the Amalekites. Secondly, he doesn't kill all the cattle and all the gold. He doesn't destroy. So in our story, Samuel comes to him and says, God gave you a command, you betrayed God. God has rejected you and your household, meaning your son will not succeed you. His son was Jonathan. Jonathan had, in our story, become friends with a very heroic young warrior named David, who was from a different tribe. That's our story. But what happens in history is that Saul fights a battle against the Philistines, and he and Jonathan are both killed. So now, in effect, his household, his line, there's someone left, but he's not a great leader. And according to what we understand about him, is he actually had a physical defect, which would have, since they were looking for a warrior, it would have been problematic for them to accept him. David, on the other hand, has already shown it to himself as a great warrior. Now, we have lots of stories about David. We have no evidence that those stories are true. And if you read those stories the way a historian reads them, David seems to be like a hired gun who has his own private army. He's charismatic, he's a fighter, and he's an organizer, and he brings troops from all different people, and they are his private army. And there's a period when he fights with the Philistines against Saul. Now, that's in our book. I'm just saying, we don't have any evidence about this, but our own books tell us that David was kind of this, he was like a hired army. He had his own private hired army. And he kind of roamed around and did what was in his interest. So when Saul and Jonathan are killed, a group of the tribes come to David, or David threatens them. We don't know. We don't know how he got the position, but he is crowned as king of some of the tribes. And then David uses his incredible skill, because he is clearly an incredible organizer and leader. He's very smart, and he's not only a great warrior, he's really smart. He does a lot of really important things. He finds ways to bring the other tribes into his kind of group. But he does it in part by establishing a center in a place that was not conquered by any of the tribes. That is the city that we know as Jerusalem. It's called the city of David. Now, I think most of you have been to Jerusalem. Okay, so this is not the old city. If you look at the old city and you remember where the wall is, and you walk directly down out through the wall and keep going straight out the Dung Gate. It's the gate that's right there where all the traffic goes, and usually which is jammed up on Mondays and Thursdays with cars. That traffic jam is at the top of the city of David. City of David goes down that hill. It's now mainly an Arab village, and there's a big archaeological dig there called the City of David. That's where David established it. Now, why did he pick that place? He picked it because no tribe had conquered it. So it was no tribe's territory. It was near a water source, and it had been known by the people that were there before, the Jebusites, which was a Canaanite tribe. It had been known as a holy place. They had had an altar to their God there. So it was known as holy. It was in the mountains. It was not controlled by any Hebrew tribe, had water, all the elements that were important. And David conquers it. And we have an interesting story about how he did it. And in fact, we have some archaeological evidence, but not for David, only for later period. So by conquering that, he's able to say to all the tribes, I didn't take any of your territory. I didn't ask for any of your soldiers. I did this for us. I am bringing us together. And the tribes decided to establish David as the first king of all the united Hebrew tribes. That's what David does, but he does more. He establishes a government with ministers, with a hierarchy of military soldiers. He conscripts soldiers from all the tribes, brings them together into a fighting unit, and he has victory after victory in the area. He fights battles constantly. He also does some other things. He has 5 wives. He has lots of kids with those wives. And those wives help him establish connections to the peoples around him. They are political in some ways. It brings other groups together. We have lots of stories of David, but David goes even further. You know the famous story of Bathsheba. Just to remind you, Bathsheba is married to one of his fighters, Uriah the Hittite. So he's a foreigner, but he fights for David. He's part of David's private army. So he's loyal to David. David has sent his troops out to fight a battle. Uriah is out fighting with his soldiers. David goes walking around one day up on the parapets of his palace, and he looks and he sees a woman bathing on top of her house. And she catches his eye. Now he's the king. So what does he do? He demands that she come to him, and he either rapes her or seduces her or commands her. Again, depends how you want to read it. And as in all these stories, one time is enough. She becomes pregnant. Doesn't work that way in most lives, but it works that way in the Bible. So she's pregnant. Now David has a problem. What's he going to do? Because Uriah's been away a while. Can't blame Uriah. So he decides to send for Uriah in order to try and arrange for Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba. So, the days you don't count exactly in those days, it would have been fine. Uriah comes back, he obeys the order. David tries to get him drunk. He won't drink because his soldiers are fighting. He needs to get back to the battle. He tries to get Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba. He won't do it because he's got to be with his soldiers. He's loyal. So David writes a little note with Uriah and says, give this to the general. In the note that the general reads, it says, put Uriah on the front line so that he dies. He does it. Uriah is killed. Now David is free to take Bathsheba. He takes her as a wife. The baby is born and is sick. Nathan the prophet comes to David and says, you committed this great sin. You stole this man's wife, and you took her when you have all these other wives. God has no favor with you now, and the baby dies. David mourns, tries, he asks forgiveness. It's the first real case of a teshuvah. David makes teshuvah. And then David has another child with Bathsheba, and his name is Solomon, who we know will become the next king. Now, David reigns for about 40 years, is successful as a military leader, as an organizational leader, right? He's created the structure. What he hasn't done is brought the temple to be built. He hasn't brought the Ark of the Covenant into a permanent home. He hasn't built a home for God. Now, our story is that God doesn't want him to because his hands are bloody. He's fought so many battles and he's done so much bad stuff. David can't be the one to build the temple. That's our story. We don't really know the story of why that didn't happen. We don't know if he served 40 years or he didn't serve 40 years. We only have our story. We don't have any physical evidence of David. We don't even have any evidence that David himself lived. We don't have any evidence that Solomon lived. Independent evidence. We do have a document now, a clay tablet, that says House of David. Now that means there was a House of David. It probably was a kingship house, but we don't have a lot of evidence. We have very little that would say to us as historians, this actually happened. Again, when we tell our story, it's not about history, right? I'm talking to you now from a historian standpoint. So they can say there never was an Exodus. There never was a David. And if there was a David, he might have been a minor king. He might have had, a few thousand followers. He might have won a few battles. There might have been a Solomon, but it was irrelevant in history. It's not the way we tell our story. It's not the way the Christian world tells the story. It's not the way the Muslim world tells the story. But again, we have no independent evidence. And modern historians demand independent evidence, because otherwise it's like me telling my grandfather's story. I got great stories from my grandfather. I love those stories. I don't know if they're true, but I love them and I tell them, right? And I hope they're true, but even if not, they're true for me. And the stories we tell our own people have meaning to us, even if historically we have no evidence. Now, we don't even have real good first temple. Because when it was conquered, it was entirely destroyed. And because for the last 1,500 years, there has been a holy Muslim place sitting on top of that space. And we haven't been able to do an archaeological dig underneath it, because archaeology is only 200 years old. So by the time we got to archaeology, we couldn't get there. It was a holy Muslim place. So we don't know. I mean, we don't know in the sense that we don't have physical evidence. We do have physical evidence about the second temple, but not about the first temple. So now we have Solomon, right? Solomon succeeds David. We have all these stories of intrigue about Absalom and about Amnon and their attempts to supersede while David is alive to become king. That doesn't work out. And finally, David, and there's a whole story with the prophet Nathan, Bathsheba, and others who convinced David that Solomon should succeed him, and Solomon does. And Solomon has this reputation as a great king, as a man of wisdom, and we have great stories about him. We also know that according to the Bible, he had about 300 wives, and according to the Bible, something like 700 concubines. Right? He was a classic king in the Middle Eastern sense, right? Or I mean, he was a king, a potentate who had a court. That's according to our story. Again, we have no real evidence about this, but he would marry women from various people who had rulerships around him. The ruler of Tyre, he would marry his daughter, Pharaoh's daughter. He married one of his daughters. But again, when you got 300 wives, you got a lot of daughters, right? You got a lot of sons. You could marry them off. It's not a great loss. It's not about personal affection. It's about political alliances. So Solomon makes a lot of political alliances and seems to have conquered a large area. When I say large area, it's still relatively small in the big picture. It's not like Egypt. It's not like Persia. It's not like Greece and Rome, but it does take Lebanon, takes part of Syria, even the southern area of Turkey. So, it's substantial by our standards. It has Jordan, pretty substantial. And Solomon seems to have had a fairly good reign, but he taxed the people very heavily. He had a big army, a lot of chariots, and he built a tremendous amount. And they were large structures. We have found archaeologically large structures that seem to reflect the building of Solomon. And that many archaeologists believe is evidence that Solomon had that construction going on. But it isn't like written on the wall, built by Solomon. We haven't found that. We haven't found built during the days of King Solomon. We haven't found a plaque. This is dedicated to King Solomon. But we did find walls that represent what the Book of Kings talks about when it says that Solomon built these special cities, right? And you can go, when you go to Israel, you can see some of those walls that were built and that have been uncovered, right? Some of you may have been to Megiddo. I mean, there were major places, major digs that we have uncovered, which seem to reflect the period of King Solomon. And so we feel comfortable in saying there was a King David, there was a King Solomon. We're now with the city of David dig. We feel more comfortable. There was a substantial city there. When I say substantial, that might mean 2,000 or 3,000 people. It's not like our cities. They didn't have sewage systems. They didn't have enough water. They didn't have the ability really to feed large numbers of people in that area. So they were limited much more than our cities or even Roman cities or Greek cities. By then they had better technology. So what we have is a King David succeeded by a King Solomon. But the tribes have never been totally happy. How do we know this? We know it because when Solomon dies, 10 of the tribes come to Solomon's successor his son, and say to him, your father taxed us too much. You need to give us relief. And this king, is not as sharp as David or Solomon. He says, if you think my father taxed you, I'm going to 10 times tax you what my father did. And so they said, bye-bye. And the 10 tribes left. They did what the South did in the Civil War. They withdrew from the Union. They were the northern tribes. And so the southern tribes, there were only 2 of them, Benjamin and Judah. All the other tribes were now north. And of course, the tribe of Levi was didn't have any land. So it was part of both groups. The northern 10 tribes established a center up in an area called Shechem, which is in the center of the country. And they establish a kingship, and they build a temple, a high place. In fact, they build more than one high place. Are they worshiping Adonai? We don't know exactly. We think they might have, we don't know. But they have their own system, and it's modeled on the southern system. Now, the southern area, Judah and Benjamin, is called Judah or Judea. The northern group calls itself Israel. The northern 10 tribes will manage to stay together. Sometimes they fight each other, Judah and Israel. But they do seem to have commerce between them. They do seem to be able to work. Members of the northern tribes come down into the southern, and the southern go to the northern. There does seem to be often friendly relationship between them, but they function as 2 states. That break takes place around the year 900. So everything I've been talking about has happened between the year 1000, right, when David took over, and now the year actually 922, but I'm giving you 900, so you don't have to work about specific dates. But it's around the year 900. We're now 2 states. That will last until the year 722. And then the Assyrians, who are in the east, they're in the Fertile Crescent. It's not Syria, it's Assyria. It's a big empire. They will come and conquer the northern tribes. They'll take all 10 of those tribes and they'll disperse them into their territory. That was a technique that some large empires used. They believed if you took people off their land, they could be loyal to you. They would no longer be loyal to their tradition. So they took the tribes and they moved them throughout their world. And they brought other tribes into that area. Again, they were displacing people in order to build loyalty to them and remove loyalty from the old tradition. Now, for our 10 tribes, it seems to have worked because those are the 10 lost tribes. We don't know what happened to them. We assume they assimilated. Now, there are candidates for the 10 lost tribes. There's a big group called Manasseh in India that claims to be from the tribe of Manasseh. There's a couple of groups in Africa that claim to be from Dan and from other tribes. There are scholars from the end of the 19th century, mainly Protestant scholars, who believe that the Irish might be one of them. There was a scholar who thought it was the Hungarians. There were a couple of scholars that thought it was Native American Indians. And this was built on the premise that their languages are unique and not related to other languages around them. Anyway, those 10 tribes got lost to us. They weren't part of the Hebrew people anymore. Now, why didn't Assyria conquer the southern? Well, we have a story that basically says they laid siege to Jerusalem. And when they laid siege to Jerusalem, God put a plague on their soldiers, and they fled home. So many of them died that they went home, and they didn't conquer the south. What historians believe is that there was a revolt in Assyria itself, and there was an attempt to overthrow the government. And so they had to pull their troops back to take care of business at home. They didn't have time to finish off Jerusalem. By the time they got home, their empire was weakened, and they no longer were coming after Judah. So Judah now had a reprieve, and Judah was able to survive until the year 587 BCE. So from 722 to 587, Judah was an independent Jewish state under a series of kings. So now, Seth, if you would, let's look at that, just to look at those kings. And you'll see what happened. And there's all kinds of intrigue. So you see Rehoboam. Now we're looking at the kings of Judah. Rehoboam was the guy who demanded extra taxes. And then we got all of these guys. You see them all? All of these guys. And there's all kinds of stories. And if you want to read about them, go to the book of Kings in our Tanakh. And there are all kinds of stories of intrigue, of sinning, of terrible stuff that they did, that they deserved their fate. And you got Manasseh here, and Ammon, and Josiah. Josiah is considered a good king. Most of them are not. And then we go down a little further, Seth. Okay, and we get to Zedekiah. Zedekiah, do you see the dates? You see 586, see it? That's when it ends. That's when a new empire called Babylon has taken over the Assyrian Empire, and they have now gotten their stuff together, and they're ready to conquer the world. And so they now go and want to conquer us. And they do it from 597 to 586. There's a whole period of conquering, and finally they are able to destroy the last bastion of Judah. Okay, Seth, thank you. So now Judah is put into exile, right? Now, during all this time of the kings, it doesn't mean the Torah was being followed, like Torah law. In fact, we know there were a lot of things going on, because if you read in the book of Kings, you'll see some of the kings actually worship Baal. Some of the kings offered sacrifices of their own children. Some of you know, outside Jaffa Gate, right? If you picture Jaffa Gate, which is the main gate to enter on West Jerusalem in the old city, right below it is a big valley, right? It goes down into a big valley. That valley is called the Valley of Hinnom, or Gay Hinnom. It's called Gay Hinnom, which is Gehenna or hell, because that's the valley where some of the kings burned their children alive to worship Baal and other foreign gods. And what else is hell for a Jewish mother and father than the death of their child? So that's why that got named Gehenna. Gay Hinnom was hell. So we know from the book of Kings that the Torah was not being followed by all the kings, and probably not by the people either. Some were following laws and some weren't. Some periods they may have established, like under Josiah. We think he reestablished some of those laws. Charles Treaster has his hand up. Sorry, Charles.
This is fascinating. I hate to interrupt you, but I want to go back to the first thing you said and tie it into the king. So if the point of our story, is to talk about what God wants us to do, and it's not about the historical part of it, then if the king's story is about all these kings and doing all these crazy things, including what you just mentioned, so where does that tie in together with what God wants us to do. Why would we read? I admit I've never read the Kings, but if I were to read, or what would we glean from the Kings about that ties us back to the first thing you said?
Right. So the book of Kings, just like the book of Judges, keeps saying, this is the moral lesson. The moral lesson is when you sin against God, God brings you down. I mean, and that's what it says specifically. He did what was wrong in the eyes of God, and therefore, right? So, but why is God not intervening? That's more of our question. Why doesn't God just say, forget this, let's bring back someone like David. I'll appoint someone who's the right person. Forget about them appointing kings, because they don't do such a good job, right? And all this intrigue. But that what we understand and our story is that God stopped doing miracles basically once we entered Canaan. After we got into Canaan, God said, look, I'm going to stop doing all these miracles. You can do this. Now you got to figure it out. I'll help, but I will not change nature any longer. And so now we get into what we might consider to be our territory of figuring it out. And we're figuring it out through this kingship, because it's the only thing we know. I mean, we don't know democracy, right? We don't know any other socialism. We don't know other forms. We don't know what to put in place. We only look around our tribes and we try to structure it the way we see the world. And so we build it with the strong is the one who runs the country, and we fall into line. However, the strong keep killing each other. There's all this intrigue at the palace. We let them deal with that, and we live our lives, and we do the best we can as long as they are able to kind of protect us and keep our crops growing. And generally they are enough that the people keep staying in line. But these outside forces are stronger than we are. And once the outside forces decide to take us over, nothing we can do. So what happens in 586? 80% of the Judea, 80% of the people of Judah are taken over to Babylonia and the Fertile Crescent, physically. They leave the 20%, mainly poor farmers, shepherds in the outskirts, and they bring other people in, including a group, by the way, called the Samaritans. That's when they got transferred in during that time. Now, what happens to our people? Well, over in Babylonia, the leadership of our people is trying to not have happen what happened to the 10 tribes. We don't know exactly how they did it, but they somehow created a gathering place, a local gathering place, and they were able to convince the people to come together where they could speak Hebrew, speak their language, and somehow they taught them the Torah. Whatever Torah, we don't know what parts of the Torah they were teaching. We don't know what parts they were following, but we know that some teachers were arising and they were starting to bring them together. Now, when that was happening, that took the Babylonian period, took about 70 years. That's an important 70 years. Think about 70 years in your life, right? That's 3 generations. The immigrants come in, they have native born. The native born get married, they have children, and now the children have just had children, especially in those days, because people married very young, right? So you're dealing with 3 or 4 generations who are now speaking not Hebrew, like our kids don't speak Hebrew, like most of us don't speak Hebrew, right? They're not speaking Hebrew. They're speaking the language of their area. Now, their area was speaking, we think, Aramaic at the time, but we're not sure. It might have been Babylonian. It might have been another language, because the Persians conquered the Babylonians almost during that period. So they might have been speaking Persian by then. But they get settled. They opened up, butcher shops. They opened up stores. They were doing business. They were doing what people do. They were making a living. And now Cyrus the Great of Persia conquers and says, go home. You're free to go home. Well, we're free in America to go home. We haven't been going to Israel, have we? We're free to do that. How many are going? Not so many from a country like this. Well, Persia was that kind of country. Powerful, prosperous, conquered the nations, had a really good culture, strong. People who were living there, the Jews, they liked it. So only about 20% went back to the promised land. 80%, as far as we know, stayed. That diaspora would remain until this very day. That is Iran. Those are the Jews of Iran today. They've been there since 586. That's how long that community has been there. Iraq and Iran, the Iraqi community is gone. They're gone, but the Iranian community still exists. Last I heard, there were like 20 to 30,000. I don't know if that's still true, but that group is still there. They have cemeteries that go the stones are wiped out, but those cemeteries, they've been burying their people there since 586. So Babylonia becomes Persia, and we now this small group comes back to the promised land under Ezra and Nehemiah. And under Ezra and Nehemiah, they establish the second temple, which is a tiny, poor reflection of the first temple. Don't have in mind Herod's temple. We got a long way to get to Herod's temple. Right now, we're just this little puny little thing that they're putting together on the same place, on the Temple Mount, to try and begin to resuscitate the old country. But the people who come back are not the wealthy. They're not the aristocrats. There are some Kohanim that come back, priests, because they've got a vested interest. They want to rebuild the temple. Some Levites come back, again, vested interest. And there are some leaders that come back. They're like the Zionists of their day, right? They believe in the promised land. Let's go rebuild our land. And they go. And that's where we're going to leave it until next week, when we're going to now venture into the two-part Jewish people. Diaspora, there will always now be a diaspora, and there will always be something in the Holy Land that is the promised land, that is called different things. We know it as Israel today. It was called Palestine under the Romans. It's been called many things, but it's the same land. It's that land that was promised to Abraham and Sarah and their progeny, roughly, because it kept changing size. Remember, I told you under Solomon it was pretty big. And today, it's not that big, right? It's bigger than it was when in 47. It's smaller than it was after 67. And it's been, growing and shrinking during even the Bible, the whole biblical period. But right now, we're in a crucial point of our people's history, because things are happening that will change the nature of who we are. And we will start figuring out a different way to govern ourselves. And by the way, we will not be in control of our own military destiny until the Maccabees show up. And that's not until the 2nd century CE. So it's another few hundred years before we even have a little bit of power, military, political power. What we will have is we will have the ability to shape parts of our structure, but not totally independent. We will not be independent again until that little period of Maccabees, and then we will lose our independence until 1947. That doesn't mean that we become an irrelevant people. We have a very rich history, but it means we won't have political power of our own, and we won't have military power of our own, and we won't really have total economic freedom of our own. We will always be in relationship to greater powers. Okay, any final questions as we're wrapping up?
Hey, Rabbi, I wanted to ask, where do the people who now self-identify as Kohanim and Leviim, that are genetically apparently pretty strongly related, is that the group that returned from Babylon to Israel?
Well, that's some of them. Probably some of them remain behind because they had established themselves. Most geneticists believe that we're less than 3% of the Jewish people qualify as genetically related to these Kohanim or even Leviim. Many people that are called Kohans today are not genetically Kohanim.
Right.
Because a lot of Jews were given the name Cohen or Levi because it's a Jewish name. There were a lot of Jews who took the name because, again, it's an easy name to pronounce. It's a biblical name. It was easy to have, but we don't know. There are genetic indicators of Kohanim today that seem to, but it's not just Jews. There are tribes. There's an African tribe that has those same markers. And again, we've been all over the world, right? Jews have been in every country, every place in the world. And we may not like to admit it, but we have intermarried all over the world. There's Jewish genetic traces. And once you have a Kohen trace, that's pretty distinct, and you can follow it. You could follow the Ashkenazic as well. There are, because the Ashkenazic intermarried. Many of us have cousins that married each other. I don't know if you have in your family, if you go back a few generations, sisters and brothers, not sisters and brothers that married each other, but two brothers that married two sisters. That was a common thing. A husband whose wife died in childbirth, who married her sister. So we have that's part of Jewish genetic diseases, is there was a lot of marrying within the towns and the villages. So it was confined. So there wasn't a lot of mixing that would have spread out some of those disease carrying genes, those markers. Anyway, so next week, we're going to look at the final ruler of our people before we get to the Maccabees, and it'll bring us to the Maccabees. Sissy, you have your hand up.
Yes, Rabbi, thank you for the wonderful class. Do you know by any chance the name of this African tribe that they may be still carrying the gene?
It doesn't occur to me right now. I remember reading about it, but I haven't. It's not in my head right now. Sorry.
Okay,
Charles,
thank you.
You got something?
Yes, Rabbi, thank you. That was a wonderful exposition you gave.
It is.
If you were going to suggest one book for Jewish history, I know my dad was a big fan of Max de Mont's book God, Jews, and History, but is there any one title or one or two titles that you would suggest?
Part of the problem of Jewish history is that because we've lived all over the world and we're part of the cultures of virtually the entire world, how do you tell the story? So there are wonderful Jewish histories that are multi-volumes. There are adequate Jewish histories that are one volume, but they all have to have an ideological view. So there's a really wonderful one, but it's a Zionist view, which basically says there was no history outside of the land of Israel. We left history with the Maccabees, basically, and the revolt and the revolt and the destruction of the temple. Basically, we ended up leaving history and didn't come back till Zionism. So that book, which is an interesting book, looks at it that way. There are one-volume ones like that talk about the Johnson. There's a non-Jew. Is that his name? Let me get to you because I'm not thinking of the name right now. But he wrote a one-volume piece in tribute to the Jews. He's a non-Jewish scholar. There are others who have written interesting, but they all come at it from some point of view. There's a 2-volume piece that you might like. It's very detailed and interesting. A guy named Simon Schama. Because I've just been rereading part of it. Schama. He's British. Schama. He has a 2-part history. The first one goes up until goes up to like 1492, and then the second one goes up to the year 1900. What does it say, John?
It says 1492 to 1900.
Right, that's number 2. So number 2 goes 1492 to 1900, and the first one begins in biblical period and goes.
Does it start at Abraham?
Yeah, he starts in the biblical period. But again, you'll see, he covers a lot of it, and he's got great stories. He's a good storyteller. But again, it's limited. It's only 2 volumes. There are also collections of Jewish history. There's a 3-volume collection of Jewish history of West Virginia. There is 3 volumes. You could write a history of the Jews, a 1-volume piece of Miami Beach, right? Forget about Miami-Dade. If you did Miami-Dade, you'd have to have one of the South, one of the Mid, one of the North. Or you could write 1 volume, but that's just Miami-Dade. Then you could deal with the Jews of Boca or Palm Beach and the history of Jews and anti-Semitism there. There's lots of ways to look at the history. There are histories of the Jews of a city, history of the Jews of Berlin. So the Schama book is 2-volume. It's a lot of pages. Together, it's probably 12 to 1400 pages. But it is written by an articulate British guy, and he actually did a PBS series, which you probably can get. Simon Schama did a PBS series on the first book, and it was really interesting. And then you can get it in 1-hour chunks, and you can see it that way if you'd like to take a look a little at that. Okay, that gives you a start.
Good.
All right, see you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
And
you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat